So the first plenary speaker for our conference is Professor Dad Neuman. Once again, I welcome you, Professor Dad. Let me introduce him quickly. Professor Dad Neuman, an ethnomusicologist and academic leader, is currently serving as Associate Campus Provost at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Since joining UCSC in 2005, he has held the Kamil and Talat Hasan Endowed Chair in Classical Indian Music, where he blends administrative oversight with deep artistic and scholarly expertise. His research focuses on the social history and transmission of Hindustani music in the 20th century, notably explored in his book, A House of Music, The Hindustani Musician and the Crafting of Tradition. His notable projects include interactive digital transcription and analysis platform supported by the Arts Research Institute. This open source tool allows for the transcription and analysis of oral melodic traditions that do not fit standard Western staff notation. His work continues to bridge the gap between traditional South Asian musical performances and modern technological analysis. He co-founded and co-directed Center for South Asian Studies at UCSC, fostering interdisciplinary research and public engagement. So without any further ado, I would now like to invite him to kindly deliver his presentation. Professor Dad Neuman.
Many thank you. And it's a real distinct honor to be invited here. And I also want to say it's a pleasure and a little bit of embarrassment to be here with my father as a discussant. We spoke this together, and it's actually a wonderful convergence of Khandani father-son performance, as well as Gharanedar activity with my Guru Bhai Stefan through Bruno. So we're hoping that this somewhat unusual configuration actually is native to the worlds we're talking about. So again, really honored to be invited to speak, and let's see if I can actually get this going. As scholars, we tend to recognize theory most readily when it takes textual form. This paper shifts that frame by examining what I call oral scholasticism, a form of aesthetic research undertaken by professional musicians through pedagogy, practice, performance, and speech. By oral scholasticism, I do not mean an implicit theory underlying performance, nor do I mean that musicians are allergic to or ignorant of the written word. Rather, I refer to research that musicians conduct through sound as it unfolds in real time. From this perspective, performance is not evidence of theory, it is a site of theorizing. So I'll trace this activity across two archives: the early 20th All India Music Conferences and mid-20th century oral archives. What both reveal are not fragments of a lost system, but living, dynamic, plural epistemologies, researched and at times argued in sound. More broadly, I want to offer a methodological invitation to treat the oral archive of Hindustani music as a field of inquiry. Thousands of hours of performance from 1903 to the present are now digitally and publicly available, from commercial, studio, field, and live recordings. Taken together, these materials open multiple horizons, each requiring its own forms of rigor to do justice to the wonderful music we all inhabit and enjoy. This leads to a second layer of this paper that my project seeks to unwind, which we heard discussed just a little bit ago. There's been a persistent misalignment between the music we study and the tools we use to analyze it. Not simply because music is oral, but because our methods of inscription and transcription were not designed to engage it, whether in sargams, staff, spectrograms, or melographs. This declaration rests on a simpler proposition. We apprehend and calibrate the kinds of melodic movements central to Hindustani music, as well as other melismatically rich traditions, simply more efficiently through oral and embodied practice than through existing graphic systems of inscription. And here's my hubris, at least until now. So alongside this argument, I want to introduce a platform I've been developing over the last 15 years, the Interactive Digital Transcription and Analysis Platform, or the IDTAP. This is an open source platform for transcribing and analyzing Hindustani performance in ways that are native to its movements in terms of articulation. I'll return to this, but I just want to advertise it. It's public, it's available, you can all use it. So I want to begin with the All India Music Conferences, because it's here that we see oral and written epistemologies converge and collide in public. The inaugural 1916 gathering brought scholars, musicians, and patrons together under a national framework. Among the many debates, one issue stood out as particularly divisive for everyone except the musicians. And this is the topic, of course, of Shrutis. Not an ostensibly fractious subject, factions nevertheless formed. At the conference, talks were interrupted and interruptions were reprimanded. Victories were declared and defeats were contested. So contentious was the topic that a standing committee was formed, only to conclude that the matter needed to be deferred. What then of the musicians? Often cast as illiterate interlocutors, they were brought back to the podium, not just as performers, but as arbiters. On one occasion, the eminent singer Zakiruddin Khan took the stage with the colonial judge E. Clements to test his Shruti harmonium, an instrument he designed to intone the 22 Shrutis described in the Shastras. What followed was a defeat of such epic proportions that it was remembered in oral histories and ceremoniously recounted in written accounts. After 2 hours of trial and discussion, the conference concluded that the scales produced by the instrument did not match those sung by the musician. But what matters for our purposes is not the outcome, not the defeat, but its implication. Zakiruddin did not reject Shrutis, nor inquiry into them. Rather, he relocated the site of knowledge, from calibrated instrument to voice, hand, and ear. This point is reinforced by the Binkar Musharraf Khan of Alwar. The minutes record him engaging classical theory, yet concluding that the precise location of Shrutis was difficult to determine, and that for practical purposes, describing rags in terms of the 12 tones was adequate. The other musicians were asked, and they concurred. But I want to say this was not a retreat from Shrutis, but a shift in how musical knowledge is understood, researched, and represented. This becomes clear during the second to fourth All India Music Conferences. By this time, debates about Shrutis had been effectively banned, and attention shifted to rag families, what the minutes translate as rag varieties. For musicologists, this was a safe shift. For musicians, Shrutis and rag varieties were integrated domains. Across multiple pages, we find detailed descriptions of rags within the Malhar, Tori, Kannada, Bilaval, and Sarang families. What is important is that these were described, debated, and presented by hereditary musicians, not just musicologists. Which raises the question, what were these varieties? Ungs, prakars, an older kind of tat? We cannot fully know, but it's important to note that these discussions took place prior to the formalization of Bhatkande's tat system, which he unveiled during the second All India Music Conference. What we do see, however, is sustained engagement by musicians with song texts and theoretical concepts, arohi, avrohi, swara usage, andolans, and pakars. Some of these descriptions appear unusual to us. Jaunpuri is listed as a tori, Bhageshwari is expressed both nishads, but that's precisely the point. We are encountering a dynamic tradition, and what is present here can be read as a mode of reasoning grounded in relation. Rags linked through shared features and differentiated through movement, emphasis, and usage. But we fully recognize this only when we move from the written to the oral archive. not to reconstruct what these musicians meant back then, but to hear what this mode of reasoning becomes in sound within a different epistemic and medial framework. To do so, we need methods of transcription that can engage musical thought as it unfolds. So let me start with a brief description of the transcription problem that many of us know. On the one side, when we turn to conventional systems like staff notation, MIDI, and other quantized representations, we get too little information. These systems assume that musical structure is built from discrete fixed pitches, but in Hindustani music, we know from the very first mean that that assumption breaks down. When we try to capture sound directly from music information retrieval, we get the opposite problem. Too much information, too much data, without a clear unit of analysis or way to interpret large-scale structure. We see everything, but cannot yet interpret it. And in the Goldilocks structure, I'd like to suggest or offer or promise that the IDTAP represents a modality in between, a representation that preserves movements while making it legible. Its central premise is simple. The basic unit of musical structure is not the note, but movement. By transcribing sound as trajectories rather than discrete pitches, it allows us to track relational motion over time. Crucially, it also enables us to annotate and segment these movements into analyzable units, syllables, phrases, gestures, articulations. In other words, it renders musical movement analytically tractable. So I'm just going to play 2 seconds of Begum Akhtar singing. We know this piece. If we ask a MIDI structure to play a faithful staff notation, it'll sound ridiculous. And then here is a rendition, a synthesis of my transcription. Okay, so with this in mind, we turn to the oral archive to analyze the forms of reasoning unfolding within speech and performance. I begin with recording of Musharraf Khan's son, Sadiq Ali Khan, from a 1963 Sangeet Natak Academy studio performance in Delhi. He opens with a brief but striking spoken introduction, where he positions his genealogy outside the literary traditions of the Mughal Kalavants, as well as the Sanskrit Shastras, yet squarely within their oral epistemological worlds. Let's listen.
दरबारी कानरा बजाऊंगा। इसका असली नाम तो है कानरा, लेकिन चूंकि अकबर जलालुद्दीन अकबर उसको अपने दरबार में बहुत ज़्यादा सुना करते थे, इस वजह से इसका नाम दरबारी कानरा हुआ। आरोही अवरोही जो है इसकी गंधार आंदोलन और दैवत आंदोलन, लिहाजा 2 विषय हैं इस मामले में, इल्म और अमल। इल्म है किताब में और अमल है करने में। अब वो आंदोलन गंधार क्या चीज़ है वो बगैर बजाए या गाए समझ में नहीं आ सकती। लिखने को लिखा हुआ है, लेकिन अगर विद्यार्थी के सामने वो रख दी जाए कि आंदोलन गंधार और दैवत लगाओ, वो नहीं लगा सकेगा, बल्कि अच्छा सा पंडित नहीं लगा सकेगा। ता वक्त के सीखे नहीं कि आंदोलन गंधार और दैवत क्या है। आरोही इसका काफी का ठाट है, लेकिन गंधार और दैवत जो है वो बड़ी अहम चीज़ है। लिहाजा वो सुनने से ही पता चलेगा क्या चीज़ है वो। मैं शुरू करता हूँ दरबारी कांडा। मैं दरबारी
So Sadiq Ali Khan introduces the rag in order to deconstruct its name. Darbari Kannada is associated with Akbar's court and attributed to Tansen. But for Sadiq Ali Khan, Darbari rests on an older foundation, Kannada, and only becomes Darbari through repeated performance in Akbar's court. What we hear then is an act of oral philology, linking contemporary practice to a pre-Mughal past. But as his remarks unfold, it becomes clear that he's not merely revising history, but asserting an alternative epistemology. This becomes especially clear when, after his opening, a Sangeet Natak Academy representative poses a familiar question about the rags ascending and descending lines. the very terms through which rags were discussed by musicians at the All India Music Conference. Sadiq Ali Khan's response is forcefully dismissive, but not of musicological topics. Rather, he shifts the ground of discussion itself. He begins by situating Darbari within a tat framework, but placing it in the kafi rather than Batkhande's Asavri tat. He then moves to a sustained meditation, indeed a polemic, on the Andolan of Darbari. For Sadiq Ali Khan, these concepts, Arohi, Avrohi, Tat, Andolan, are vital, but they do not exist as independent, disaggregated atoms. They exist in sound and in motion. He makes this explicit when he frames Andolan through a contrast between ilm and amal, knowledge and action. In Islamic thought, the goal is to unite them, but here he presents them as fundamentally unassimilable. The Andolan may be described in books, but it cannot be realized through them. When one asks the trained Vidyarthi or the learned Pandit to perform it, they cannot. I read Sadiq Ali Khan as offering not a sectarian critique, but an epistemological one. By invoking Pandit and Vidyarthi alongside ilm, he folds Brahmanical and Islamic traditions into a single argument, one in which scriptural knowledge mistakes definition for comprehension. And crucially, he does not reject Indic theory. The concept he centers, Andolan, is unambiguously rooted in the Sanskritic aesthetic universe. But here the concept is animated through an oral and performative register. And this is what I mean by oral scholasticism. Not the absence of research, but its realization in and through sound. As Sadiq Ali Khan was a participant at the All India Music Conferences, his position helps us understand those debates, but we cannot view his stance as a simple continuation or recovery of them. Rather, the recording marks an oral intersection where musicological inquiry and musical practice encounter one another, but do not operate on the same terms. In this sense, the oral archive does not simply extend musicological inquiry, it reveals a parallel genealogy in which theoretical concepts are developed, tested, and transformed by professional musicians within pedagogy, practice, and performance. With this in mind, we turn to another inheritor of this world, Vilayat Khan, whose father and grandfather were also important participants in the conference. And I'll try to, actually I have some time. For Vilayat Khan, Shruti and Andolan are not discrete classificatory categories. They are articulated through the concept of Ang and Chalan. He too engages rag families, but where the All India Music Conference minutes linger on varieties, which later formalize into tats, he moves to another system, the system of angs. For him, an ang is a phrase that travels across rags like a melodic gene. It does not define a rag, but carries a recognizable musical inheritance, a morphemic imprint through which rags can be heard, studied, and conceptualized in relation, even across scalar frameworks. In the next example, he sings Kannada not as a rag, as Sadiq Ali Khan did, but as an ang, anchored in the phrase ma pa ga. In each instance, he renders komal ga with different shrutis and distinct andolan. To demonstrate the ang, he first moves through the shrutis between swaras. The key point, as with Sadiq Ali Khan, is that these concepts are not treated as independent identities.
This Jaunpuri is re re ma ma pa pa ga ma pa ga Darbari ma pa ga Bageshwari ma pa ga Bahar. So all these gandhas,
It's the same phrase.
It's the same phrase.
Just
but
because he's using it in a different piece.
So what emerges here is a different kind of system. The pitch material remains constant, but identity shifts through Andolan, Shruti inflection, and the movement of the phrase itself. Crucially, the rags he demonstrates, Darbari, Jaunpuri, Bageshwari, and Bahar, belong to different scalar lineages. While all share the Kannada genetic cell, they diverge in their treatment of Daivad, Komal in the first pair, and Tivra in the other. So rag identity here is not scalar, it's relational and mobile, articulated through the logic of Ang. This becomes even clearer in his discussion of Puriya Kalyan. For Vilayat Khan, Kalyan is not a rag name, but also an Ang. anchored here in the phrase pa maga re, in which re and ga must be tivra. Since the rag in question contains neither the characteristic phrase nor tivra re, it cannot, according to Hasan, be Purya Kalyan. This is why, as he explains, his elders called it Purva. And let's listen to him.
The first time I have heard Purva, so-called Purya Kalyan these days, from Ustad Ashik Ali Khan Sahab, I liked it very much. Then with my curiosity, I asked Bundu Khan Sahab the next day, Bundu Khan Sahab, I will call Mamu. And I would respect him as my Ustad, as my Mama, as my elder, as my master. And I like that. So he said that Purva is very easy. You know Purya Dhanashwari? I said, yes. So he said that it is like a Purya Dhanashwari, but it is used Tivra Dhaivad. I said, yes, very good. And when you use Tivra Dhaivad, then if you abolish, don't use Pancham, only use instead of Komal Dhaivad, Tivra Dhaivad, then what it will become? I said, then it will become Purya. Okay. If you use Pancham in Purya, then it is Purva. After so many years, I don't know why people started saying Purya Kalyan. In Purya Kalyan, there is no Kalyan. Kalyan is a particular ang, particular use in any rag. Kanra is a particular use of few. The first time I have.
So, through Bundu Khan Sahab, Vilayat Khan receives a dialogic lesson in rag identity as relational adjustment. Modify Purya Dhanashri, it becomes Purva. Modify Purva, it becomes Purya. This logic does not expand into a full modal system as the Tott framework does, nor does it aim at universal taxonomic reach. Its reasoning is local and relational. A second principle follows, at least for Vilayat Khan Sahab. If a rag invokes an ang, it must realize it in sound. Purya Kalyan names Kalyan and so carries that demand. But since the ang is not present, the rag does not hold. The result is a kind of negative proof. The rag fails to live up to its own name. And it is precisely at this point that we come to our final case study, that of Bari Ghulam Ali Khan. He enters our story not to dispute Vilayat Khan per se, but to offer a very different epistemological horizon. In a private concert from the mid-20th century, Bari Ghulam Ali Khan offers one of the most extraordinary renderings of Purya Kalyan I've ever encountered. He opens the performance with a disarming provocation. Purya and then Kalyan, is there a meaningful pathway between the two? So let's hear his provocation, and then we'll conclude this with a reading of his performance.
मैं गाने लगा हूँ पूरिया कल्याण, पूरिया और फिर कल्याण, कुछ मायना रखता है बात। अगर पूरिया में रिखत दे के हम पूरिये की तरह गाए, तो फिर क्या पंचम से कल्याण होता है? पंचम किसी वक्त छोड़ भी देते हैं करने वाले लोग। अच्छा, उसको भी जाने दो। पूरिया की चाल कल्याण में गाओ, तब पूरिया कल्याण गाओ। और जो वैसे गाना तो मैं तो नहीं मानूंगा। कल्याण में रिखत की सूरत हम दिखाएंगे, कैसे जैसे पूरिया में लगता है वैसे कल्याण में कैसे लगता है।
What he proceeds to do in performance is nothing short of aesthetic engineering at its most daring. Treating Gade Sa as a potential bridge between two rag worlds, Purya and Kalyan, he constructs a passage where none had existed, using Tivra Re rather than the expected Komal Re. But even here, resolution is deferred in motion. Through the transcription, we can see how he treats Re differently. At times, he bypasses it with the mean from Ga to Sa. At other times, he flickers on Tivra Re, and at other times, he lands on it directly. Meanwhile, the absent Komal Re, introduced only in the Drut section, shapes the entire Vilambit as an expectation, almost audible in its absence. His question, commentary, and performance form a single argumentative chain, culminating in his declaration. Puriya Kalyan is only born when the chal of Puriya merges with the chal of Kalyan. Let's now watch this unfold in real time through the transcription. You can actually go on YouTube and listen to the entire performance. It's exceptional. But now that we've heard it, we can return to this image and see these as four distinct modalities: bypass, glide, inflection, and event. These are not different notes. They are different ways of inhabiting a note in motion. Each reconfigures the listener's sense of the bridge, showing that rag identity resides not in the note itself, but in the relational logic of its pathways. Only in the drut does he render komal re. So within a single performance, he holds together two scalar logics drawn from opposite ends of the taxonomic system. The rag is not a fixed object for him, but a field of movement capable of holding multiple, even contradictory essences at once. Komal re and tivra re here are co-present possibilities within an unfolding path. Taken together, these three musicians show that the oral tradition is not an anti-theoretical residue of pre-modern practice. It is a contemporary, dynamic site of oral scholasticism. By engaging the oral archive, we encounter not just lost knowledge, but a living epistemology, plural, relational, and argued through sound. For these musicians, theory may be peripheral, but theorizing is central. It does not precede sound, it unfolds within it. For much of the 20th and 21st century, our methods have been misaligned with our object of study. We have either too little structure or too much data. With tools that begin to align inscription with sound, we are now in a position to change that. The task then is not simply to recover or appreciate this archive. It is to develop forms of inquiry capable of doing justice to it, to treat musical performance not as material to be described, but as thought itself. And thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the next speaker of this plenary session, Dr. Stefan Fiol, Professor of Ethnomusicology and affiliated faculty in Anthropology and Asian Studies at the University of Cincinnati College, Conservatory of Music. He's the grandson of Professor Bruno Nettel, a distinguished ethnomusicologist. Since joining CCM in 2010, his research has focused on music, dance, ritual, and media in Uttarakhand, Himalayas, and North India. His book, Recasting Folk in the Himalayas, received the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies Jim Fisher Book Award, and his current projects explore drumming as a historiographic tool and the role of music and mindfulness in cognitive function, developed through collaborations with therapists and neurologists. Professor Fiol's work has appeared in leading journals and edited volumes, supported by fellowships from Fulbright Nehru, Wenner-Gren, AIIS, NEH, and the University of Cincinnati. He earned his PhD in musicology from the University of Illinois in 2008 after extensive fieldwork in India with additional projects in Chile, Paraguay, and Zimbabwe. Trained in classical piano, he also performs on sitar, umbira zawajimu, hope I'm pronouncing it right, and Himalayan instruments. Welcome, Professor Stefan Fiol. The session is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to all of you at the University of Hyderabad for hosting this beautiful conference. I'm so excited to engage. I have pre-recorded, partly because I didn't know how my brain would be functioning here at around 1:30 a.m. But I will just ask that you play the recording, and I hope to engage with the questions afterwards. Thank you. Greetings. My name is Stefan Fiol, and I just want to thank the conference organizers, and also just to say that I'm honored to be on this panel with Professor Dan Neuman and Professor Dard Neuman, and I look forward to the discussion. I want to start just by playing a brief video clip of the Dhol Damao from the Garhwal Himalayas. The Dhol and Damao, and how can this tradition be ethically sustained and stewarded in the 21st century? These are fraught questions that intersect with contemporary caste and gender politics, with competing oral and literary epistemologies, and with changing roles for Dhol and Damao across rural and urban contexts. Despite these drums having been transmitted and maintained for centuries within hereditary Dalit families, locally referred to as Auji, Bajgi, or Dholi, referring to the social role, there has been a dramatic rise in interest among Savarns in learning this art form. And I'm thinking specifically of Brahmin and Thakur or Rajput communities in Uttarakhand, but generally just perceived caste-dominant individuals. This interest is a direct result of the growth of the folk music industry, evidenced by the naming of Dhol and Damao as official regional instruments of Uttarakhand some years ago. And it's also linked to the more recent refusal of many Dholis to perform their hereditary obligations for patrons. So today I want to explore a couple of mixed caste institutions where Dhol Damao is now being taught, but I'll begin with an origin story about Dhol Damao that foregrounds issues of caste ownership. Parvati wanted to dance, and so Shivji created the dhol and presented it to Brahmaji. There were 4 Vedas, but Dhol Sagar is the 5th, Shyam Veda. Brahmaji refused, so Shiva requested Vishnu, but he also refused. Parvati was disappointed, so Shivji brought it back to Brahmaji, who created the Kondoti, shoulder strap, and put it around Shivji's shoulders. Shivji then played the 5 types of Brahmashabd, or Duyal, from which 5 human forms of Shiva emerged, and he sent them to Bhulok. Thus Shiva gave knowledge to the Auji community, who played in his lineage or vansh. They alone have this spiritual power, which is not in others. This story was recounted to me by numerous drummers during my fieldwork in the Garhwal Himalayas. And this origin story is part of the Dhol Sagar, an esoteric and elusive treatise composed in a mixture of Gorkhali, Pahari, and Sanskrit languages that contains tantric and cosmological stories of the Dhol Damao. While some transcribed excerpts from the Dhol Sagar survived, such as this one, and some have then been published in the 20th century, it primarily exists as an oral tradition within the Dholi community. And these narratives emphasize the exalted position of the drummer, but variants of these stories can also convey an element of original sin, whereby Vishwakarma or another divine progenitor knowingly or unknowingly commit an act of pollution, such as killing a deer for its skin or putting the mouth to the skin in the act of making the drum, thereby forever marking descendants with a lower status. Such narratives relate to scriptural descriptions of the relationship between 2 of the forefathers of Hindu society, Lord Vishwakarma, the divine architect of the universe, who many lowered status artisan communities regard as a spiritual ancestor, and his uncle Brahmaji. According to many scriptural accounts, Vishwakarma wears the sacred thread, suggesting a status equal to Brahma. Yet one dholi related the following story that accounts for Vishwakarma's fall in status. Vishwakarma and Bhagwan were both tempted to eat a cow, Kapila Gai. Then the cow was butchered and divided up, and both ate their fill, and it was time to wash hands. But Bhagwan said he wouldn't wash hands after Vishwakarma, as the latter had killed a cow and eaten it. He responded, Bhagwanji, you have done the same. But the latter revealed all the meat which he had merely piled up in his sleeve, thus tricking the unsuspecting Vishwakarma. From that point on, the latter, and presumably his descendants, was doomed to untouchability. So depending on where, when, how these narratives are told, and maybe most centrally who tells them, they can either reinforce the rigidity of the caste hierarchy, naturalizing the subservient position of the drummer, or they can satirize the system and elevate the position of the dholi. Shekhar, a singer-songwriter from the Rajput community of Pauri Garhwal, insisted to me that Brahmins were once the most knowledgeable drummers in all of Uttarakhand. If the tradition had remained in their hands, he claimed, then all rhythmic patterns, or bhajas, would have been transcribed in their original form. As proof of this, he noted that all existing books on the Dhol Sagar from the 20th century had been written and published by Brahmins. Unfortunately, dhol playing passed on to the Das community. He lamented, and as long as the dhol stays on their weak shoulders, it will remain weak. The Dhol Sagar clearly shows that there was but one way to play each of these bhajas, he told me, and pulling Shiv Prasad Dabral's 1989 publication entitled Dhol Sagar Sangraha off the shelf and pointing to specific transcribed examples. Contemporary drummers may insist they're correct, but that's only because of illiteracy and the corruption of the tradition over time. Shekhar then related a story that his father used to tell about a Brahmin drummer who beat out a Das or a Oji drummer during a Shabad performance at a wedding. The latter conceded defeat and asked the Brahmin from which Das had he learned to play, implying, "Who is your father?" The Brahmin apparently stopped playing the dhol damau from then onwards because of a perceived insult that his father could have been an Oji. So from our conversation, several themes emerged that I think are relevant to questions of caste ownership. First, Shekhar assumed that inscribed knowledge was more authoritative and reliable than orally maintained knowledge, to the extent that an inscribed version of a bhaja written by a Brahmin scholar in 1989 was more valuable, more authoritative than the hereditary knowledge of the unnamed drummer from whom this Pandit undoubtedly copied out the transcription. One of my dholi collaborators put it thus: Brahmins have done the work of a typist, working with Ojis who were illiterate, but they don't own this knowledge. And this same interlocutor told me a story about a Brahmin elder from Jakol who thought he could play as well as an Oji, and he was struck down dead. Second, I think in these conversations there was an assumption, possibly coming from the tabla tradition of which Shekhar was a student, that the cycle length is the primary determinant of what a bhaja is, of its ontology. And this is a point that's been critiqued by Professor Andrew Alter, among others. And related to this point, Shekhar assumed that all performances of bhajas derive from a single authorized structure, an ur form that has degenerated over time. This is refuted by evidence from my own ongoing large-scale study of bhajas from various parts of the region. And without going into a lot of details, what I'm finding is that there are very distinct dialects of this dhol damau drumming that take shape in relation to geographic features of the landscape, the pilgrimage routes, and kinship settlement patterns, so that you can actually identify very distinct dialects across the region. Shekhar, of course, also reiterated an idea that has been perpetuated by a number of Savarn intellectuals in Uttarakhand in recent years, that Brahmins were once the authoritative drummers and bards of the region. I find this a particularly violent co-optation of the source of identity and power within hereditary drumming communities. And it's not an accident that the anecdote Shekhar uses to explain why this one Brahmin stopped playing Dol Damau was rooted in the logic of caste discrimination, linking the social role of drumming to a specific Oji social identity. Shekhar's narrative justifies Savarn reclamation of the Dol playing tradition by insisting that Ojis, and not centuries of Savarn caste oppression, were responsible for decay in the Dol playing tradition. The idea that Brahmins were the former custodians of Dol Damau and are thus the saviors of its future can be a way to refute the realities of caste oppression by escaping any shared accountability for the oppressive patronage conditions under which Dalit bodies have and continue to labor for centuries. Some Savarns have used these narratives to subvert the demands of Dalits by claiming reverse discrimination and assuming an aggrieved position for themselves, bolstered by ideologies of divine sanction, settler colonialism, and strategic erasures and distortions of history that maintain superiority at all costs. One Brahmin professor told me that reservations and the climate of caste wokeness were prohibiting members of his community from playing dhol, thereby restricting their opportunities for livelihood and upholding the barriers of caste that they seek to tear down. I think such arguments pose a barrier to social accountability and healing. Shekhar's discourse is also rooted in a neoliberal ideology of individual choice. At some unspecified moment in history, he claims Dalit chose to take on the responsibilities of musical performance, or, in Shekhar's narrative, Savarns chose to leave it to Dalits. More recently, many Dalits are choosing to abandon these responsibilities, and in response, Savarns are merely choosing to assume responsibility of playing themselves. Yet this emphasis on choice ignores a patronage system rooted in mutual but inequitable obligations between perceived dominant and lowered castes. Male members of hereditary drumming families generally do not have a choice about where, when, or whether to perform. It's a mandatory obligation to their patrons, and those who abandon this responsibility can face violent consequences. Finally, Shekhar's narrative presents a causal link between lower caste abandonment and upper caste adoption. Yet these two processes are happening in different social contexts that are largely independent of one another. While in village settings, the performance of ritual singing and drumming remains exclusively the duty of hereditary artisans, upper caste youth are seeking out opportunities to learn and perform this music in the semi-urban and urban settings, where there are more lucrative commercial opportunities. So rural and urban settings are rooted in quite different economic and prestige systems. With my remaining time, I want to explore how these discursive tensions around communal ownership and stewardship play out within several multi-caste contexts where Dol and Damau knowledge is being transmitted. At one of the government universities in the region, there is a certificate program in folk arts and culture that allows students to receive credit for studying Dol and Damau. And the program explicitly emulates the Guru Shishya Paramparik model from Hindustani musical contexts. Students are asked to learn from a village-based drummer for an extended period of training, after which they return to campus for an examination and perform in front of a faculty committee. But because this institute hasn't hired any hereditary drummers on staff, the evaluation is completed by individuals who do not intimately know the repertoire. I had the opportunity to interview one of the drummers, the hereditary drummers, who trained a university student under this certificate program. The student wanted to learn a very central item of the repertoire, an asymmetrical baja called bade. And after 10 days, he was becoming frustrated that he couldn't play it. So this dholi drummer told me that these things take time. The student wasn't really dedicating himself to the task. But then some weeks later, the guru was summoned to campus to sign the certificate at the end of the program, indicating that the student was trained. So despite limited exposure and minimal competence, this student would presumably be able to use this certificate and potentially get employment to teach folk music. Another context that I'm ethnographically exploring is a folk music institute founded and directed by a well-known hereditary drummer in the capital city of Dehradun, where hereditary Oji and Savarn students learn to perform on dhol and damao. I interviewed 6 Savarn students and 6 students from the Oji hereditary community. All of them came to this institute 3 days a week, and despite the fact that there were no fees or tuitions, only one of the 6 Savarn students had informed their family that they were enrolled in this institute. They were embarrassed to be publicly associated with dhol playing. One Savarn student remarked that his parents were supporting him while he was looking for work, and if they learned he was using any of his time on learning drumming, they would likely turn him out of the house. At a public concert held 5 months after the initial period of studying, only 2 of the 6 Savarn students in the group attended, again pointing to the ongoing stigma.
हमें एजुकेट होना पड़ेगा. अगर कोई ऐसा कहता है कि नहीं है गलत हो, अगर हमें कहता है कि चलो आप करके दिखाओ, तो हम उसको करके दिखा सके. हमारे परिवार में, हमारे गांव में ऐसा बंदा होना चाहिए जिसको करके दिखा सके, जो वेल ट्रेंड हो. तो उनके जो इस तरह का परिवार है, जैसे कि कालिदास के परिवार से है, जो बजाने आ रखा, जो बजा रहे हैं, तो उनके मन में रहेगा कि यहाँ पे मेरे को बिल्कुल अच्छा बजाना है. गलत बजाना तो बिल्कुल बर्दाश्त नहीं है. अच्छा बजाना है, नहीं तो वो खुद बजा देंगे.
This student's narrative reveals a casual comfort with caste supremacy. His motivation to learn dhol damao was not to become a proficient performer, but to know the bajas well enough to surveil the performances of Oji drummers in his village. He sought to assert his authority as a quality control expert and a patron who could enforce oversight and correction. I'd like to end by thinking about a few different models for the sustainability of the dhol damao performance tradition, and by extension, possibly other hereditary musical practices across South Asia. One model follows the logic of free market development and cultural nationalism, or dhol as regional heritage. There's no question that the growth of the folk music industry has created new opportunities for artists, both hereditary and non-hereditary, to teach, perform, and lay claim to this knowledge in a range of contexts. Those who can monetize the tradition are doing so, and dhol damao are conceptualized as emblems of regional heritage. Yet the risks here are that the growth of these commercial opportunities surrounding traditional drumming are skewed towards the urban areas where non-hereditary performers lacking expertise are most likely to benefit. Another risk is that the tradition becomes significantly diluted and starts to emphasize more standardized and virtuosic aspects of the repertoire. Another model follows the logic of the ritual economy and patronage systems that have existed for centuries, right? So here, knowledge transmission of dhol and damao is restricted to these caste-based hereditary lineages. But the risk is that ongoing caste-based stigma, discrimination, bonded labor will lead more hereditary artists to abandon drumming as a form of livelihood. To varying extents, both of those models are being implemented and continuing, but a third model points towards a more ethical kind of stewardship, a middle path, perhaps, in which Savarn non-hereditary artists come into relationship with hereditary drummers. Rather than claims of ownership or surveillance, ethical stewardship asks how privileged bodies might center caste-based histories and truths with cultural humility and accountability. Others can learn Dol and the Mao with the understanding that that belongs to Oji hereditary communities. Borrowing an idea from Jeff Todd Titan, Dol de Mao performance may be understood to enact a cultural commons by bringing Garhwali communities into relationship with Devi Devtao, with the land, and with each other. Some of my examples from this talk in intercaste learning context reveal the perils of this particular path. Reconditioning from caste supremacy is very challenging work, but it must be reckoned with in order to bring about corrective community formation in which everyone thrives. I will end here, and thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to Q&A. I see, Andrew, did you have a question?
I do have a question. Is it all right if I ask one? Thanks, Stefan. All right, many of you will find Stefan has answered all my questions from my paper 2 days from now, so you don't need to watch it. A very simple question. Here you've tackled the problem that I've always had to tackle and not done very well with, to when people ask you, how do we save this tradition? How do we protect it? And you've provided a theoretical overview that does do that from a theoretical stance. How do you adjust your answer to those questions that I'm sure you've been asked many times when you're talking to people directly, when they ask you, how can we save this tradition of Dhol de Mao?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's obviously a very complex question, because of the variety of positionalities of people asking that question, right? So and also the social context more generally of where that question is being asked. So part of what I was trying to explore is how different we have to approach that in a rural setting with these very embedded caste structures, as opposed to a more urban setting. And then also, of course, what is the work of the person asking that question? It's different with different bodies. Even myself, I mean, I would often, and you probably had this experience studying these traditions from a kind of white body. It's a very different onus, and sometimes that would be thrust on me as if, you know, Professor Fiol, you're learning this, and our own children don't want to learn this. I would get that reaction a lot. Oh, like as if I am somehow in it and playing it and learning it to sort of show what others can't do or something, right? So that's a very, again, it's about each person's position and what we have to assume and work on. So I think it's a very poor answer to your question, but I think people are looking for a quick and easy way to say, you can save it by doing this. And I think what I'm saying is this whole tradition is really underwritten by a lot of challenging histories, and we can't run away from it. We have to collectively look at it, take accountability for it, and that's the way towards healing. And ultimately, everyone has a stake in it and can play it. I don't think the right answer is to say this is exclusive, but in order for other communities to enter into it, there has to be some honesty, I think. So that would probably be my, whether I have the guts to tell that to every single person, I don't know, but that would be my answer.
Sir, if I may bring in Professor Ravi Sharma wants to ask you a question. Professor Ravi Sharma, sir. Okay, I'll ask on his behalf. He says, why the family members of Dhol community are not learning Dhol these days?
So it's primarily the young people, but not entirely. I've met quite a few in the older generation who've also stopped playing. And it's primarily because of stigma, because of a sense that they will be treated as less than by association with the instrument. And certainly more in the younger generation are turning away from it for that reason. That's a very, very common story. There's also a very, I think the ritual economy doesn't provide a livelihood. Now there are more opportunities in urban places. Weddings in the urban centers are more lucrative, but in the rural areas, people have been turning away from this. And that has produced a really interesting consequence where those who are continuing to do it are in more demand. And sometimes if you are playing for patrons outside of your own village, you can demand a better fees and you can thus, make it a livelihood, because the people in most of the villages have stopped playing, or many of the villages have stopped playing. Those who continue to play can actually now turn out a little bit more of a livelihood, but the status issue remains.
Thank you very much, sir.
As we have Professor Daniel Neuman as discussant, I might sound a little emotional, but indeed this is a very emotional moment for us. Just as the sun needs no introduction, such is the eminence of Professor Daniel M. Neuman. And what makes this moment even more special is, despite being in an online space, his presence transcends all distance and reaches us with the same warmth and inspiration. Sir, it's truly a moment of deep honor and heartfelt joy for us to have you here today. Even across screens and time zones, your presence feels close, guiding, and deeply meaningful to all of us who gathered here. We genuinely feel blessed to have you joined us, sir. Your work has illuminated paths for generations of scholars and musicians, and today, through this virtual platform, the light continues to inspire each one of us. As I said, he needs no introduction, yet it is my privilege to briefly reflect upon his extraordinary journey. A distinguished ethnomusicologist, he is widely recognized for his leadership and scholarship, notably serving as Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost at the University of California, Los Angeles, Interim Director, UCLA, Alpert School of Music, Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director, New Center for Arts and Culture, Boston. His research focuses on the social organization of Hindustani classical music and the ethnography of Indian music culture. He also pioneered digital humanities projects, including Atlas of World Music and the World Music Navigator. I know we all are very eager to listen to this legend. So I take this privilege to invite most respected Professor Daniel M. Neuman to kindly share his remarks. And it's actually a very extraordinary moment to witness the wisdom of two generations of the same gharana as Professor Dad told us. And this was a brilliant idea of Professor Sanjay Bandyopadhyay to bring all three of them together. So I welcome Professor Neuman again. So we are here to listen to you.
Well, thank you for those very kind words. I really appreciate them. I also appreciate Sanjay's invitation as well. And it's a great honor for me to be here. In the interest of full disclosure, you know already that Dart is my son, but Stefan Fiol is the grandson of my own guru in ethnomusicology, the late Professor Bruno Nettle. So it is one big family, in case that wasn't clear in the earlier introductions. Having confessed, allow me to celebrate the excellence of both these outstanding papers, each the result of many years of research, with a few words about what makes their contributions notable and how they intersect with one another. I will be reiterating some things because I think sometimes it's good to underline through a different interpretation what has been said. Before beginning, allow me to outline what I see as the three central findings that these papers share. First is that their central epistemologies are embedded in performance knowledge and are disseminated through oral and oral means and not inscribed in written or notated systems. Second is the central role of heritability through which these epistemologies are transmitted through time in the form of kinship, be they lineages or local caste groups. Third is the pervasive attempts of dominant caste groups to usurp, for a variety of reasons, claims of original ownership of these inherited forms of musical production. So these are kind of three central themes that I think runs through both of these papers. For each of these papers, I have a favorite quote, each grinding the oral against the literary. For Dard's paper, he says, this is not a clash of theory and practice, but between two great epistemic systems, one grounded in writing and externalized measurement for study, the other in orality and internalized measurement for expression. And for Stefan's paper, my favorite quote from it was, Brahmins have done the work of a typist, working with Ajis who were illiterate, but they don't own this knowledge. Dard's paper. In Dard's paper, the focus is on epistemology. What is knowledge and how do we come to know something? Oral scholasticism is offered as a fundamental alternative to both the theory-practice binary and the implicit theory assumption. Instead, what hereditary musicians do when they speak before singing or playing is explicit theorizing. And performance is not merely evidence of theory. Performance is itself the site of theory. That distinction is central to his paper. He opens, as we've heard, with a scene of the 1916 All India Music Conference. The Kirudin asked to demonstrate Shruti in a calibrated harmonium. Mr. Clements refuses the instrument and relocates the demonstration to voice, hand, and ear. That gesture, the musician's relocation of research from inscribed measurement to the hereditary body, sets the terms for everything that follows. The three ustads at the center of his paper are heirs to that moment. Dard draws primarily on three pieces of recorded material: the 63 studio recording of Sadiq Ali Khan, the commentary of Vilayat Khan on Puriya Kalyan, and the private concert recording of Bari Ghulam Ali Khan. These are not novel recordings, but what is original is their treatment. The paper takes the recorded speaking voices of the ustads sitting inside their performances as primary analytical evidence. The brief introductions musicians gave before they sang are read as theoretical statements, and the performances themselves are then analyzed for how the theoretical statement is worked out in sound. That double reading, speech and music, with the ID tap transcriptions of the performance used to show what the speech is describing, is an original methodological move. The actual musical elements, Andulan for Sadiq Ali Khan, Ang Chalan for Vilayat Khan, and the Chal for Bari Ghulam Ali Khan, each is a way of knowing with respect to the ontological basis of a rag. Dard's paper does not claim these are the only ways, rather these are given as an entry into a much larger field of inquiry. What's original here is not the identification of the terms, they appear throughout Hindustani discourse, but the comparative treatment is three related but distinct epistemic horizons articulated by three ustads across the same half century, all oriented by a common underlying commitment to rag identity as dynamic rather than categorical, and that is very important. This is quite distinct from the usual discourse concerning what makes a given raga unique. I was going to say a little about the ITAP framing. I'm going to skip that because it's getting late and I don't want Stefan to fall asleep. It's, I think, very, very late there and getting late here. But taken together, the paper's originality is the conversion of a category, oral scholasticism, into a reading practice, speech and music in the oral archive, all into a comparative analytical frame, the three horizons, if I can put it that way, of kinetic rag identity, into a methodological diagnosis. We'll call that the Goldilocks problem. Each move builds on the previous one, and the argument accumulates rather than being assembled laterally. In Stefan's paper, the focus ultimately is on stewardship. He asks, as we just heard, who owns the dole and domang? And how can this tradition be ethically taught and stewarded in the 21st century? His paper's contribution is based on what I would call his thick description, revolving around several key elements. The first is the use of a sustained interview with a single articulate savarn, that is a Rajput interlocutor, Shekhar, as one side of the ideological anchor for the whole analysis. Rather than surveying the sovereign reclamation discourse in aggregate, the paper stays close to one voice, traces that voice's logic carefully, and lets the structural pattern emerge through the particular. The paper uses Shekhar's recommendation of Dabral's 1989 Dol Sagar Sangra as a specific case where reformist textualization becomes actionable in the Garhwali case. The second is found in his analysis of two distinct institutes, one located in the Srinagar University that provides certificates for students studying the Dol Dama drums, but there's no faculty expert in this knowledge, so students learn from village-based drummers. In the one particularly interesting case cited, the village drummer was obliged to sign the certificate even though the student wasn't yet trained. The other side of this is the Folk Music Institute in Dehradun, founded by a hereditary drummer. There, the class was divided 50% between the dominant caste students and 50% the hereditary drumming students. But only one of the dominant caste students told their family about studying there because of this extreme stigma still prevalent associated with drumming there. Their motivations for studying the drums were varied, but at least one dominant caste student was learning in order to ensure that the hereditary performances were done correctly. Over here, we would call that chutzpah. Over there, I would just say that presumption underscores the challenges of the traditional hierarchy. Another element is the Ukhal comparative table based on Fiol's earlier research. 12 drummers, 3 districts, 4 structurally distinct renderings of the same named Baja. This is a dialectological evidence, and it does precise analytical work. It refutes the Ur form thesis empirically. Within the scope of this paper alone, the table is a genuinely original piece of musical analytical argument. It treats regional variation as evidence against single origin narratives rather than as evidence of corruption. Finally, there's a 3-model typology, what might be called applied ethnomusicology: free market development, restriction to hereditary lineages, and intercaste learning contexts. Each of the first 2 paired with its distinctive failure mode. The paper advocates for ethical stewardship. It is in fact a middle path in which dominant caste articles develop relations with hereditary drummers with, as Stefan puts it, cultural humility and accountability. He recognized how difficult this would be to achieve, but he says this must be reckoned with in order to bring about corrective community formation in which everyone thrives. Stefan's calibrated restraint is distinctive. Taken together, the paper's originality is a matter of combining a carefully chosen ethnographic focus, one interview, and institutional ethnography, the two places where drumming is taught, a systematic comparative corpus, the 12 drummers, and a candid typology of institutional options, 3 models with paired risks into a single argument about stewardship. The central tension here is between, on the one hand, the hereditary, non-hereditary competition between communities, and on the other, the formation of institutions in order to promote one or another vision for the ontological claims to origins, and this, I would argue, claim to primal authenticities. This is a phenomenon, as you all must know, which we find again and again in Indian case studies. And I could give a long lecture on that topic. How are we on time? How the two papers connect. The two papers meet most productively, not at the level of institutional analysis, they're doing different things there, but at the level of hereditary epistemology. Read Dard's paper back into Stefan's. Is there an oral scholastic tradition among the Auji drummers analogous to what Dard documents for his Khandani musicians? The Dole Sagar origin narratives and the Dole's critique of Brahmin typists suggest that there is. Stefan's Dialects of Dole project that he's working on already takes the hereditary drummer's knowledge seriously at the level Dard accords to Hindustani ustads. Dukhal table documents a structured body of dialectical variation that the drummers hold in memory and can reproduce on request, and Stefan reads this variation as a historiographic evidence. Conversely, Fiol's ethnography gives sharper political texture to Dard's historical claim. The Zakaruddin Khan scene at the AIMC, the musician's relocation of research from the calibrated harmonium to voice, hand, and ear, takes place in a room the musicians did not design in front of interlocutors who did not share his epistemic commitments. Fiol's Shekhar interview shows parallel dynamic unfolding a century later, a Savarn interlocutor asserting an inscriptional authority, the 1989 Dubral transcription, against which the hereditary drummer's practice is measured and found corrupted. The continuity across a century is striking. Dard documents the hereditary response at the moment of the encounter with reformist inscription, and Stefan documents it a century later, now defending against a localized version of the same move. Let me just conclude that there's a way of looking all of this in terms of a hereditary intellectual authority that shows itself at each stage in the longue durée of the 20th century, starting with the IMC musicians, Shruti, research to voice, hand, and ear, and then the ustads of the oral archive who articulated Andalang, Ang, and Chal, to the drummers today who refute the Ur form thesis in the idiom of typist critique. Read together, Dard's analysis and Fiol's ethnography document an ongoing tradition of hereditary theorizing that moves through different forms and different registers. This framing makes the two papers complementary rather than structurally parallel and keeps each on its own ground. Dard's is a historical archival argument and a methodological platform for engaging that archive. Stefan Fiol's is an ethnographic political argument and an analysis of a contest over stewardship. They meet in their shared refusal to treat hereditary musicians as anything less than theorizing subjects. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over my time.
Thank you so much, Professor Neuman, for your thoughtful and illuminating remarks on the two presentations. And yes, we have to go forward with the next presentation by Dr. Aditi Dev. I would like to request Dr. Pavni to introduce Dr. Aditi Dev.
Thank you, Dr. Pragya. It's a pleasure to now invite Dr. Aditi Dio for her presentation. Dr. Aditi is an assistant professor in the Performing and Visual Arts and the Social Sciences Division at the University of Ahmedabad. She's an ethnomusicologist with a doctoral degree from Indiana University, Bloomington, and has research interests in music of the Indian subcontinent. She has also held important academic positions as faculty fellow at ICER Pune and as a postdoctoral fellow at Oxford University, reflecting her strong engagement with both research and teaching at prestigious institutions. Aditi has made significant contributions to archival preservation through her work with the Archives of Traditional Music and the Archives of African American Music and Culture at Indiana University, where she was actively involved in the preservation and curation of valuable sound collections. She is a widely published scholar with several articles and chapters to her credit. Her work has explored Hindustani Khyal music, Hindi film music, and various folk traditions, addressing important conceptual questions related to performance practice, pedagogy, technologies, and heritage. So let's now move forward with her presentation. A very warm welcome, Dr. Aditi. The session is yours.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Pragya, and all the organizers for making this platform available. I'm so honored to be part of this conference and in such eminent company. And I hope that this sparks a conversation around music and related subjects, even beyond the conference. So my paper is titled Gaadi Bula Rahi Hai, The Train is Calling Out, Considering Old Hindi Film Songs as Embodied Knowledge Among Urban Elderly Adults in India. It draws upon ethnographic research in the city of Ahmedabad, India, with urban elderly adults who sing Purane Gaane or old Hindi film songs and participate in karaoke groups centered on this repertoire. The larger project focuses on their engagement with popular music from youth as one mode through which they negotiate the multiple personal and social shifts associated with aging. While embodiment, epistemologies, or knowledge are not central concerns in this larger project, in this paper, I try to look at my material through the themes of the conference. I suggest a few ways in which old Hindi film songs function as an embodied cultural resource that these adults draw upon in their everyday lives in the present. My presentation today is an early analysis of the ethnographic material. As such, many of my ideas are still tentative, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Namrata, can you move to the next slide, please? I begin with an ethnographic snapshot. Fiercely independent, Panna Bain lives by herself in a small bungalow in a quiet upper middle class neighborhood in Ahmedabad. At 70, she spends her free time dabbling in a few hobbies and pursuing her passion of singing Hindi film songs. As a child, she had a few opportunities to sing. However, after she got married, there was a gap of several decades. Her formal lessons in semi-classical music began when she was almost 50 years old, when she lost her young son in a tragic accident. At the time, she was in despair and needed to find a purpose to live on. Music, she told us, was a lifesaver. Even when her lessons stopped, music stayed on as a steady companion. Panna Bain continued to sing over the next few decades as life brought in more challenges, including early widowhood. Music and singing are of immense importance in Panna Bain's present. Among the many things she shares in our conversations is a list of songs she likes to sing. Geeta Dutt's Mera Naam Chin Chin Choo is one of them. When I sing that song, I'm a totally different person. Otherwise, I'm very traditional and proper. But when I sing that song, I become the heroine. I feel whatever I'm supposed to feel, and then it comes in my voice. Panna Bain frequently performs in karaoke club concerts and was recently also invited to judge a few singing competitions. While she enjoys this new identity that she has crafted around music, there is also a cautiousness to her involvement in karaoke circles. Even at 70, as a single woman, she is careful about not sharing much about herself. As she says, she does not want anyone to gossip about her. Listening, singing, and performing are some ways that Pannaben relies on music to reconcile with the challenges in her life. These are also the modes through which she is gradually calibrating facets of her identity as a senior citizen in Ahmedabad. Namrata, can you move to the next slide, please? Pannaben is one among the many elderly people whom I interviewed. I met all of them as members of various karaoke clubs in Ahmedabad. In the past decade, the city has seen numerous formal and informal groups come together around karaoke singing. Described as clubs, these groups are structured partly as intimate musicophile communities and partly as concert platforms. Elderly adults from middle and upper middle classes form a significant section of the participant and listener demographic. My interviewees were all part of an urban, financially secure, retired demographic. However, they were also very different in many ways. They varied significantly in age. The youngest ones were in their early 60s, while the oldest ones were past 80 years of age. Familial and financial situations ranged across a wide spectrum. Some were healthy, mobile, and socially active. Others had complex ailments and chronic pain that left them mostly stuck to home. What they all shared was a love for Hindi film songs, for singing, and a desire to perform for audiences. The songs were a mode of aesthetic pleasure, philosophical insights, and reminiscing. The popularity of karaoke, specifically Hindi film song karaoke, among elderly adults is a growing phenomenon not only in Ahmedabad, but across various parts of India and the Indian diaspora. In my research, I was frequently told that turning to this activity was a response to the gradually changing realities that accompanied old age. The previous stage in most of my interviewees' lives, that of prime adulthood, had been characterized by economic productivity, social authority, and familial responsibilities. The transition to becoming elderly in age and in social roles brought in major life shifts. These included physical and mental fatigue, limited mobility, and age-related diseases. Several among my interlocutors had adult children who had migrated to other cities. Some had experienced the loss of a partner or even a child. Further, retirement from active professional roles had opened up free time as a problem to be managed. Such factors had gradually led to a shrunken social life, restricted activity, and a sense of loss of control. What was remarkable about the stories of my interviewees was their choice. It was the choice that they were making to navigate major life shifts with the help of music and music-centered sociability. Many described the positive transformations that music and karaoke clubs had brought into their lives. For instance, a lady in her 70s said that she forgot her physical pain and her emotionally distant children when she practiced her songs. Another gentleman viewed karaoke club gatherings as a respite from his primary role as a caretaker for his ailing wife. Music also helped with everyday issues such as a lonely evening or a bad mood. As one of my interlocutors shared, when I'm sad, I start singing. When I'm happy, I start singing. What was also remarkable was the centrality of the specific repertoire of music that held together these groups of elderly people. The karaoke groups in Ahmedabad were all centered on Hindi film songs from the mid to late 20th century, a genre often referred to as Purane Gaane or Sadabahar Gaane, old songs or evergreen songs. In the later part of their lives, my interviewees were not encountering music in its universal reified form, but were interacting with something deeply personal, something with which they had an old relationship. Indeed, musical anecdotes about other cities in India, as well as the Indian diaspora, pointed to the significance of these songs for the larger community of Indian senior citizens across the world. Relationality, it goes without saying, is a central aspect of musical experiences. The fact remained, however, this repertoire of popular music anywhere from 40 to 80 years old, continued to have significance for more than 2 generations of elderly Indians. Can we move to the next slide, Namrata? There's this brief video clip that I want to play just to get a sense of what the participants are like and the spaces of performances, which are very different from how usually American or East Asian karaoke bars are shown. Can we not see the video? Slide number 4, please. Namrata, if it's not working, we'll move on.
The video is not getting played, I think.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to kind of emphasize that these spaces are much more like, you know, community gatherings, family gatherings, rather than karaoke bars that we usually see in Western or East Asian media. And I'll kind of continue. So my presentation today draws upon interviews with elderly karaoke club members in Ahmedabad. It explores the varied registers in which Hindi film songs function for them as a cultural resource. The research is informed by scholarship in 3 distinct areas. Namrata, we can move to the next slide. 1, sociology and anthropology of aging in India that examines the transformations in the experiences of aging. 2, studies in ethnomusicology and sociology of music that address the uses of music in everyday life. And 3, writings in ethnomusicology and film studies that focus on Hindi film songs and their circulation. Recent scholarship on aging in India draws attention to the impact of globally circulating discourses, such as Peter Laslet's concept of the third age and Rowan and Kahn's discussion of successful aging that emphasize the aging individual self as a project. One trend that resonates with such discourses is the cultivation of organized leisure practices, such as tourism or hobby classes, among financially secure Indian elderly adults. The involvement of my interviewees in karaoke clubs can be understood as an instance of this trend. Their participation, they said, was a mode of maintaining emotional and physical well-being as a responsibility towards themselves and their families. And I believe this is a very different kind of narrative that we are now hearing among aging adults. Such use of music aligns with T.R. Denora's discussion of music as a cultural resource that listeners deploy in order to obtain desired outcomes for themselves, be they about mood regulation in real time, the curation of specific memories over longer periods, or the forging of their identities. Building on Denora's arguments, popular music scholar Andy Bennett has examined the uses of popular music among aging fans. He argues that popular music, while often acquired in youth, continues to shape identities and worldviews and can also become a tool for communal bonding in later years. The presence of old Hindi film songs in the lives of my interviewees reflects some of these ways in which music from the youth animates the present of elderly adults. Hindi film songs have been the quintessential popular music of India for almost a century. Since the production in 1931 of the first Hindi talkie film, diegetic songs have been a central component of films produced in the Bombay-based Hindi film industry. Over time, these songs assumed the status of a popular music genre, circulating well beyond their original contexts and acquiring long afterlives. Most significant for my discussion are the songs from the 1950s to the early 1980s. These songs, produced in the decades immediately following India's independence, were widely circulated and consumed on the radio and later the national television. Scholars such as Jason B. Jones and Vibhuti Duggal have independently argued that the continued hold of older Hindi film songs over Indian audiences can be traced significantly to their early modes of circulation. According to B. Jones, this has resulted in the songs being regarded as popular music heritage whereas Duggal discusses their role as lingua musica that cuts across distinctions of class, gender, and caste values. Both these roles of old Hindi film songs were foregrounded in my ethnographic research. In these contexts, and generally in relation to older Indian adults, how do we think of music, specifically old Hindi film songs, as an embodied cultural resource? Let me share a few examples from my interviews and ethnography. For my interviewees, music functioned, in T.R. Denora's words, as a quote-unquote technology of the self. While not explicitly present, the embodied dimensions of listening, singing, and performing were always part of the conversations. My interviewees often turned to Hindi film songs and music-centered sociability as a way to build positive affect for themselves and others, even as they negotiated the constraints and possibilities of their lives. To them, the repertoire of old Hindi film songs offered the pleasures of listening and an escape from unpleasant aspects of their everyday realities. Almost invariably, people mentioned the several years of listening to these songs on the radio, cassettes, and later TV as a foundation for their keen interest in music in the present. Some listeners shared how music had helped them to tide over difficult times in the past and associated particular songs with particular movements. Some discussed the songs, their lyrics, and the experiences of growing up with them as lessons in philosophy. Panna Bain, whose story I began with, shared how while listening to Hindi film songs, she had internalized some of the dayapan or the wisdom built into them. For instance, she said, the song Gaadi Bula Rahi Hai. The stanza is, Seene mein hai aag, sar pe hai boj, fir bhi ga rahi hai. Life is like that. You may be sad, may be burdened, but if you cry, nobody will look at you. Can we move to the next slide, Namrata? While in the past and the present, everyday listening was often distracted, singing and practicing for karaoke performances was a time for attentive listening. Singing and the focused attention to voice production that it required gave them the joy of creative engagement. Trying to parse through vocal nuances and imitating a song were activities that engaged not just the ear, but the complete self. Shikha Jingan has described that for the copy artist, the whole body becomes the ear. Indeed, it was not just the body, but the body-mind that converged to listen in order to imitate. One interviewee, Kamini Bain, mentioned that hours would disappear when she focused on preparing a song for the next karaoke gathering. Another 78-year-old karaoke enthusiast described how singing regularly had had a positive impact on his disposition over time. मेरा बहुत गुस्सा था, घर में भी लोग परेशान हो जाते थे, अभी मुझे गुस्सा नहीं आता बिल्कुल, कुछ भी बोलो ठीक है. I had a lot of anger. My family members would get exhausted. Now I don't get angry at all. Whatever you say, I'm okay. Performing in karaoke clubs, that is singing for an audience, was a different kind of embodied experience. Listening and singing in private had been, for many of my interviewees, easy to pursue at all stages in life. The desire to perform, however, had been a much more challenging pursuit until recently. While men interviewees had been unable to sing dedicatedly due to professional pressures, the women cited domestic commitments and social expectations as a primary reason. One woman who had a short stint as a small-time professional singer mentioned the difficulty of negotiating moral judgments that she had faced when younger. However, many of my interviewees also shared that as they grew older, they were learning to gradually disregard expectations and pursue what they truly desire. At this later stage in life, the social acceptability of karaoke clubs made it possible to perform regularly for a supportive community. The clubs also gave them an opportunity to actively redefine their identities in old age and even to imagine amateur careers in singing. The social act of singing in public was an exercise in crafting new identities, not only through musical effort, but also through an embodied presence. For new singers, karaoke was an opportunity to demonstrate vocal skills. Many stood awkwardly and sang with a straight face focused on reproducing the right melody to the karaoke track. The performances of seasoned karaoke singers, however, were a curious amalgamation of the playback voice and the on-screen bodily presence that made up the original song. These singers deliberately crafted the vocal intonations, facial expressions, and gestures to evoke the original. Archit Bhai, a 78-year-old entrepreneur, went even further. During his interview at home, he showed us the special stage costumes that he had collected over the past few years. These costumes, a colorful shirt for a Shammi Kapoor song or a kaftan for a Mahmood song, often try to evoke the characters portrayed in the song picturization. Most men and women took efforts to dress up for their stage and to have an embodied impact. At the same time, there were clear distinctions in the experiences of public performance along the lines of gender subjectivities. If Panna Bain had shared how she owned the character of the heroine when singing a peppy cabaret song, she was also cautious in her social interactions within karaoke circles to avoid gossip. Such duality between freedom on the stage and caution in personal life was a frequent theme in interviews with women. Can we next move to the last concluding slide? To conclude, the passing last week of Asha Bhosle, one of the last among the first generations of playback singers in the Hindi film music industry, was unanimously described in popular media as the end of an era. It brought forth an outpouring of tributes discussing the many ways in which her songs had mediated cultures of listening and performance in India. One tribute mentioned how Asha Bhosle had changed what a woman's feelings were allowed to sound like. Another described how her transgressive tonalities articulated an India learning to be capacious. On the social media groups that I connected with during my research, individual fans reminisced about the range of genres and emotions that Asha Bhosle had rendered so easily and evocatively. They also described that they aspired to sing like her. This presentation was about such individuals who listened to Asha Bhosle and other musicians of her generation. Listeners like Panna Bain, Archit Bhai, and Kamini Bain, but also the countless others that are spread across India and beyond. In their youth, old Hindi film songs had been a ubiquitous presence. They had taught these elderly listeners to feel and to express their feelings through words, voice, and the body. The repertoire had gathered strength as a cultural resource over a lifetime of familiarity, and it could now afford them pleasures, purpose, and wisdom. The embodied activities of listening to old Hindi film songs, singing them purposefully, and performing them on the karaoke stage were some of the layered modalities through which the repertoire continued to be a medium of feeling, expression, and embodiment. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aditi Dio, for that insightful and engaging presentation. Your perspectives have truly enriched our understanding and inspired further reflection. Any questions?
Yes, Professor Neuman.
I have a question.
Yes.
As somebody who probably belongs to the parallel generation of many of your informants, I was curious about how they learned their music, because the Pets only came to India around 1973-74. All India Radio did not broadcast film music until much later, and television media didn't become common until really the early 80s, I guess. And so I'm wondering how they learned this music. Did they learn it in their older age when the media was more common, or did they just, in a karaoke sense, read the things and remember the melodies? Do you have a sense of how they learned that repertoire?
Actually, apart from the small period during B.V. Keskar's time as the chief of AIR, Hindi film songs have been a central part of radio broadcasts throughout from the 1950s onwards. And in that small period when they were not being broadcast, Bina Ka Geetmala, which was broadcast through Radio Ceylon, was one of the most popular, band in India. Once Vivid Bharati started, Vivid Bharati was a channel that was dedicated to Hindi film songs. I think Hindi film songs penetrated the whole country, across class, across castes, across regions. So most of my interviewees talked about listening to these songs as more distracted listening throughout their childhood. I think this has been part of what my mother's generation also talks about, that they heard songs playing on the radio throughout the day because it was extremely focused. There were very few alternatives. There were a few kind of channels, but beyond that, there were very few alternatives to Hindi film songs as an entertainment medium. And in fact, that is what Beaster Jones and Duggal also say, that because this is such a concentrated way in which people are listening to the songs, it continues as something very, very powerful even into the present. But to answer your question about how do they learn these songs, I think YouTube has taken over. YouTube makes it possible for people to listen to the songs, but also to access karaoke tracks. And there are several apps now. This is in the last few years, 5-6 years, like Star Maker, and I think Smule also has several Hindi karaoke tracks where there are a lot of karaoke enthusiasts of all ages. They record their songs and they post their songs to be heard by each other. And that's a different space that I've not addressed in this paper at all. But it's extremely interesting to see how quickly and enthusiastically this particular, format of expression people have taken on. And it's becoming much more prominent in the last 10 years or so because of the technological access, I think.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Neuman.
Just as an extension to this, there's one question from Dr. Ritupaban, where he wants to know, does this karaoke singing actually have an important impact on the live music industry? How does it impact?
That's another fascinating space that has opened up, actually, because this is something one of my one of the professional singers that I'd interviewed said, that if people can hear themselves singing, why would they want to go and pay to listen to others? So Bollywood nights were a big part of the Ahmedabad cultural scene until I think COVID hit. I think COVID really made a big difference. And that's also something that's part of the larger project that I'm looking at. So they were saying that before that, people were ready to go and pay to hear Bollywood covers in concert halls. But what happened during COVID is that this became, it was impossible to go out and hear people singing Bollywood covers. So people started singing in family gatherings or online, or just recording and sharing their music. And once that kind of, they got a taste of that, even after COVID, karaoke became an equally, like a competing space of enjoying Hindi film songs. And gradually what has happened is that the way that payments are made to live musicians has changed. Orchestras still continue to be paid, because once you sing to karaoke tracks, the next aspiration for karaoke singers of all ages is to sing to live orchestra. So you still have live orchestras being employed to perform for amateur singers, but live orchestras being part of paid Bollywood cover events of professional singers, that has decreased quite a bit. So yeah, thank you for that question. I think, a lot of changes,
Thank you so much for your thoughts, ma'am.